Hmm.
Yay.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody. I am tempted to eat this popcorn actually while we're online here.
Don't do that.
Don't do it.
It's
Bad
nothing
idea,
worse
bro.
than watching people eat on
Well,
video.
we could do like the whole thing where you get to hear me eat.
No, thank you.
No?
I mean, I can leave if that's what you want.
It's just one sure way to get somebody to leave a room.
It's one of the things that makes like my skin crawl is hearing people eat things.
Yeah, like the schmatzing.
Yeah.
Oh,
One of the like one of the biggest fights I think Jackie and I have ever had is she started licking an ice cream cone in the vehicle, like in the car as we were driving home, and I just can't handle it. Like it's just
like you heard
irrational.
her licking the ice cream cone?
Uh-huh. Like just the spit in your cheeks or whatever. Like just that sound.
Just drives you nuts.
Oh man, it is instant anger. Instant. So yeah,
So there's therapy for such things, buddy.
yeah. Yeah, like you mean mouth therapy for people to not
Well,
be
I was
so.
actually thinking more of maybe there's some issues you need to work through.
I just feel like I understand when people say, speaking moistly. People like nobody can eat an ice cream cone not moistly.
That just sounds gross.
Yeah, well, just imagine the sound that it makes. It's
Yeah,
disgusting. It makes
it's
the skin crawl.
disgusting. Hey, everybody, thanks for tuning in. If you are here, give us a little bit of a shout out. Let us know that you're here. I'd like to be able to know who we're interacting with today.
Mm.
I'm told that I need to enunciate better. So I will do my best. I find that when my sugar levels are high, I slur.
Are they high right now?
Probably. I mean, they're always high.
But yeah, really. I find I slur much more when my levels are low.
Oh, really?
hmm But I start getting really sloppy in a lot of things when I'm low. So,
Interesting.
hmm hmm
Hey, I want to tell you about a time as a family we went to an escape room. Specifically, the one we did was I think it was called Spaceship or Spacecraft or something
Mm.
like that. Whole premise behind it, and this is like the very first one we did. Hey, Alex, good to see you. Thanks for joining us here. This is the very first one we did. And so we go in and they're prepping us and they're letting us know like there's only X amount of time that you have to be able to solve these problems and get out of this escape room. And hey, good day, Ken. We're just talking about an escape room right now. So we go in and we're solving all these different puzzles and we get towards the end. And as we're getting towards the end, the sirens start going. It's getting loud. It's dark because we can't see a thing in there. And all this while, apparently, there's like this alien chasing us in this thing. And so people are freaking out and all this stuff. It's loud. It's fun. We're screaming. We're having a blast. We're laughing at each other. But we felt absolutely like trapped in this thing. Like there's no getting out if we didn't find the right um, answers, solving the
Mm.
clues properly.
Mm.
And so we felt very, well, yeah, I think the word is trapped, very restricted in our movement, restricted in our ability to be able to get out because we thought we had the answer, but in fact, we didn't have the answer. And so we ended up finally solving it and getting out. But I mean, talk about like stress, blood pressure going through the roof, we're sweating, we're having fun, but we're under a lot of strain and still trying to solve whatever puzzle it is that we were trying to solve. So it
Mm.
was fun. We had a really good time.
Yeah, that sounds like tickling to me.
No.
Like for me, if and this is dangerous saying this on a public forum, but if someone tickles me, my reaction is to hit, because for some reason tickling makes me feel trapped like that. Like I don't like it. I feel very like invaded, and
Sure.
so I do whatever I can to excuse myself from that situation.
So, like,
And
have you ever been held down and had
uh
people tickle you?
huh. My brother used to hold me down and spit Like he would spit down and like hang spit above my face and like
That's
things like that.
that's terrible.
Like yeah, no, and like that's where I think I got a lot of that, is just like I don't like feeling like that, and so I start getting, well,
Panicky.
violent. In all honesty, I had a friend that he was just joking around with me, and I was on a top bunk in our at our Bible college, which was about 2 inches from the ceiling, and he came and tickled me, and my response was to hit him in the face, and I kicked a hole in the ceiling
Oh,
with
did
my
you really?
foot. Yep, and like I just don't. It's not something. So I guess that's something to discourage people. Like, don't tickle me unless you want to get hit, because you'll get hit.
Or enter renovations for your room.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's just that natural reaction for me when I get in that position of feeling like restricted or panicked or things like that. If it's
Sure.
like, at least when I was a kid, maybe not so much anymore because I think I've trained myself a little bit more. But like when I was a kid, I definitely just reacted, and it was instant, and it was violent, and it was
Wow.
so.
Sam, I agree with Sam. Sam says that brothers are terrible. Sam, I cannot agree more. I will confess that I was a terrible brother. We actually, like at one point, my youngest sister, so she's 4 years younger than I am. I must have been like, I don't know, 7, 8 years old when we did this.
Hmm,
We put her in the clothes dryer and turned it on.
nice.
Yeah.
I
It's not
What's
awesome.
wrong with that? It's
What's
did
wrong
you?
with it,
I
right?
mean,
It's on tumble dry.
yeah,
Like,
you're making sure she was clean and
but
soft.
you know, but it's one of those things. Like you open it up and she's freaking out, right? And
Yep.
obviously, like we've created a scenario here that
Yep.
was not good for her.
Yeah.
Um, and so these things that we have in life that create sort of that fight or flight
Hmm.
scenario,
Hmm.
and I was just kind of evaluating like what are the things that create sort of a fight or flight response in me,
Hmm.
and then as I'm thinking about those things, I mean, I don't really know all the things that create a fight or flight in me, but I do know that there are things that frustrate me, they anger me, um, and I don't always know what to do with that. I don't actually
Mm,
even know what to expect out of myself sometimes with some of those
yeah.
things. Sam says that her brother used to beat her up with her own. Oh, that is sad. Beat you up with your own Cabbage Patch. Those are collector's items.
Yeah. Yeah, I think again, like I definitely have trained myself to be a little bit different in the fight or flight response, like over time, but it definitely took a while for me to get to that point. Um, and even still, you don't know how you'll always react in those kinds of particular situations.
See, isn't that interesting? Like I come across this quite a bit, especially when men do this a lot. I don't know how much women do this, but we sort of create those what if scenarios, and we would say things like, "Well, if I was in that scenario, I would do this or I would do that," and all the machismo comes out. Right? We're all beating our chests and talking
Yeah,
about all the things that we would do, but
yeah,
we have absolutely no idea what we would do if we're faced with that
yeah.
scenario. Right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like I was one of the biggest things that I learned in some of the like security and active shooter things that I've trained in with some of the SWAT team people. One of the biggest things that I learned is sometimes fight is the answer, and sometimes flight is the answer. And it
Sam brings up this idea of that now apparently they have added freeze. And I think that's true, right? Like some people would just
sure,
freeze,
yep,
right? Like they
yep,
just become, paralyzed almost, right?
yeah.
Like immobile.
Well, and I think it depends on the situation as far as like we can act or we can prepare as much as we think we need to prepare. But until you're in that situation, you genuinely don't know what is going to happen because there are way too many outside factors that you can't mimic.
Sure.
But yeah, it's interesting because I just realizing that fight is sometimes the answer, flight is sometimes the answer. I don't know that freeze is ever the answer, but there's that idea of like, oh, well, sometimes it's okay to run away and it's a good idea, like, um
I think depending on
specifically.
what it is, it's usually often the better response, right?
Well,
Like,
and like in specifically the active shooter situation that we're learning about in this
sure.
scenario, it was like, well, you have your family, and there's a shooter on the other side of the mall. What's the proper response? And the proper response is get the heck out of there. You have everybody that matters. The police are there. They can handle it. Whatever. It is not good for you to go and escalate the situation by including more people in the situation, and so sometimes the wisdom dictates you get lost.
Yeah, you just get out of there, right?
Yeah.
So that brings me to a topic I wanted to talk about tonight. So as of late, I've been trying to find other places that I could find information, news on topics that interest me.
Mhm.
And so certainly, I mean, you can you can learn all about politics and the stuff that's going on here in North America as it relates to um, cultural movements and certainly social movements, that kind of idea, politics, um,
Mm.
Hollywood. But I wanted to know more about what was going on within the Christian world. And so I was interested, okay, so where can I find news on trends happening in the church? Where could I find news on um, kind of best practices and all that kind of like, or even just like the good stories of where we get to hear the stories of people coming to faith in some fashion. And so I came across a site called christianheadlines.com. christianheadlines.com. And I just posted the link there for anybody of you who might be interested in, seeing other news that's out there more from a Christian perspective. And so I go to this site, and even just like yesterday and today, I'm looking at it, and I'm thinking about church, and I'm thinking about the early church, and then I come across the topic of Christian persecution
Mm.
as a sort of a title here. And there are so many things going on in the world around us right now as it relates to the underground church or the persecuted church that, quite frankly, as a North American believer, if I don't take time to find out more about it, I'm not going to learn about it.
Mm.
Like it's not something that you're going to see in mainstream media. And so, I mean, look, I'll just read you a couple of the headlines here. I mean, they're difficult, but Christians forced to reconvert to tribal religion in central India. And the whole idea here is that all but 10 families fled a central Indian village after followers of tribal deities threatened to kill the 10 Christian families if they refused to convert back. Released from prison, Algerian Christian faces persecution in Tunisia. So, after being released from prison in 2018, having served nearly 2 years in prison, he is now facing blasphemy laws, and he's dealing with further persecution there.
Mhm.
German pastor is hopeful in fight to remain in Turkey. So there apparently there's this expulsion of Christian leaders in Turkey because of their Christian faith. And there's so many different things. Chinese Communist Party shuts down house church and seizes its property. Church members abducted from a bus in north central Nigeria. I mean, these are not things we're hearing about.
Mm.
Christians seriously injured in a mob assault on a house church. This is taking place in central India. And how about this one? A life sentence for Christian in Pakistan changed to a death penalty.
Mm.
And the reason was because he was convicted of sending a blasphemous text message in 2011.
Mm.
These are the things that are going on in the world that we just don't hear about. We don't know about. How about this? This is horrible. And I'm just going to tell you now, like, if you have a sensitive ear, this is a hard one to hear. Pastor's relatives raped after imam's wife turns to Christ. So a mosque leader reportedly sent men to rape 3 female relatives of a church pastor in Western Uganda because the imam's wife put her faith in Christ. An imam within Islam is very similar to being a pastor. And so I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, man, like in all of these different places, Christianity is essentially outlawed. We know that there are places in the world where Christianity is absolutely illegal. And so it made me wonder, how did the early church deal with being outlawed, right? So I think the first example we have, or I know the first example we have of Christian persecution takes place in the book of Acts. And specifically, we're talking about Stephen being martyred for his faith. And then we turn to Acts chapter 8, verse 4, and says, those who have been scattered preached the word wherever they went. So here's my question for you, Andrew. Something to wrestle with. Our faith is outlawed. We no longer have access to the stuff online. The big name preachers are no longer able to preach. The big churches are no longer able to sustain having services. What happens to our faith? What does it look like?
Well, I think it's twofold. For my perspective, is that you're going to see true faith. So people who are truly followers of Jesus will actually be more mature in their faith, because I think there will be a huge resurgence into personal study of the word. So I think people will rely on their Bible more for what they need.
Here's a question for you, though. Because in the underground church, the Bible is outlawed.
Sure. But even in the underground church, they have, what I've heard anyway, is they'll get, a copy of it, or a page at a time, and they'll copy that down. At least I know of a few different stories in China that's happened. And so I think you'll see a lot of that kind of increase. But I also think that you'll have to, or if people really want to continue having the fellowship that we talk about having, you'll have to start seeing people get into the underground church. And whether that's in a home or a basement or abandoned restaurant or whatever, I think that's what we'll start seeing. I don't think it will look the same as what we have as far as our church services go.
That's an interesting thing, right? Because, I'm thinking, I remember a number of years ago, local business out of Morden had brought in, and I'm not going to state the name just because this is online and I don't want anything damaging to happen to anybody. But they brought in 2 underground church pastors from China, changed their names in order to be here in Canada, because if their name got out, the government of China would have certainly persecuted them and chased them down. And so they talked about what it was like to be a pastor in China, in the underground church. And this is amazing to me. They got 6 months of Bible training, and then they were sent out. And with the expectation, not just imagine this, like with the expectation of dying. And so there was a case, one of them, his dad had gone out as a preacher and was killed. His older 2 brothers, each on different occasions, went out as preachers, as evangelists, and were killed. And so he was the only one left. And his mom understood that he felt called into this. And in her prayer time, she was forced to wrestle with God, like, God, like, you are asking me to endorse sending my son to his potential death. And so the world that they live in is just so different. So he ends up here in Canada, and he's telling us about this. They get 6 months of training. They're sent out into the mission field without any expectation of coming back. And they're growing like in like millions upon millions. And so it makes me wonder, like, what does our faith here in Canada look like, or North America for that matter, if we were to be faced with the same level of restriction?
Yeah, I think it'll be a maybe people can answer what they think as well in our comment section, but I definitely think that there will be a time of upheaval. Like I think there will be a time where uh you will see chaos a little bit in the church or in the people of the church, I guess. Um before it gets to that point where we just see, because I mean, not that it's good where China and these locked down countries are as far as their freedom of religion goes. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but I also see a genuine faith that sometimes I feel like in North America we don't have, because we've been, I don't know, we've been blessed for sure. And do we take advantage of that blessing, or do we take it for granted?
Yeah, and I want to avoid the trap of just beating up on the North American church, right? Because that
Sure.
doesn't
Yeah.
benefit any of us
Yeah. Yep.
either. Actually, my take on that is actually really straightforward. If the church is the bride of Christ, well, I know how I feel if people start saying negative things about my bride.
Yep.
And so I'm
Yep.
not interested in us, because whether you're going to comment online or whether we're going to do it here um, with each other, there's a danger of just throwing the North American church under the bus.
Hmm. Yep. Yeah, that
I
was not
do.
my intention. I hope that that didn't come across that
No,
way.
it didn't. I just want to set the
Yep.
definitely just kind of set the tone there of how do we go from where we are to probably where we need to be, right?
Hmm.
PJ. So this is interesting because so Sheila, you're saying that you believe that our faith will just get stronger. At the same time, PJ, you're saying that you believe that there would be a lot who would walk away. So is it possible that both are true?
Hmm.
For some, faith is going to get stronger. For others, they're just going to walk away. I think I'm just going to say this: COVID has shown us something.
Hmm.
I have not, and you guys know this. I have not made any real big public statements about COVID-19, and so please do not understand this as a big public statement about COVID-19. What I am saying is, what I hear a lot of us doing is um, moving into this conversation about our rights and our freedoms. So, what happens if they're gone?
Hmm.
What happens to our faith without the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? That's a big one for us, I think.
Yeah, and again, I think it's appropriate that we were talking about things that you know situations where we don't really know until it happens. And I think that there's some of it, not to end this conversation, because it just, there's much more that we want to talk about tonight, but like, I don't know what would really happen to the church as a whole. I feel I can relate with what Sheila said, as far as like, I know my faith will get stronger because I will be forced into a situation where I will need to be pressing into the Lord even more,
Mm.
especially as a pastor who relies on this. But I can also see, I agree with PJ as far as maybe the overall view of like, have we counted up the cost that Jesus talks about? Have we really looked at what it means to follow Jesus Christ? And I don't know, in my heart of hearts, I don't know how many of us have. I don't know that I do all the time that I need to.
Right. Yeah. PJ, the idea that change is difficult and confusing, you're absolutely right.
Hmm.
I cannot imagine the adjustment that the early church had to have made when the big persecutions started,
Yeah.
right? Like they saw Stephen martyred. And then from there, the persecution started. People were getting tossed in prison, families were getting torn apart.
Hmm.
And so people just got out of there. They just got out of Dodge and they tried to go somewhere safe.
Yeah.
And I wonder, hey, you know what? Is that going to be part of the process as well? Are we just going to, you're just going to take off and try to figure out
Mm.
safety issues, these kinds of things? I'm looking at this and I'm thinking there needs to be a stronger conversation for us then whether or not our rights and privileges would be taken away at that point. I
Mhm.
don't actually hear the primary conversation I heard from these two gentlemen that were underground church pastors was, how do we reach more people? That's what their concern was. They had a concern for eternity. And
Mhm.
so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, okay, oh, here we go. Sheila, this is an interesting point, right? I think that this year of COVID has been a dress rehearsal. You know what? Yeah, it could be. I mean, I've heard a lot of people talk about that kind of thing, and
Mhm.
that could very well be. I'm going to be very careful not to put my tinfoil hat on right now, personally, because that's such an easy thing for me to do. But I do wonder here, if we were to take some. Okay, so if we were to look at the underground church and say, how do we thrive in faith and with the gospel message if our faith became illegal? What would need to change about how we do our faith, how we practice our faith? What do you
Mm.
guys think? You know, post something. What do you think would have to change in your? Maybe you could start maybe as the church as a whole, but then maybe even something personally. What would have to change for you in order for you to be able to adapt into that kind of an environment where your faith is illegal? All the print material illegal, all the online material illegal. It's gone. Everything is gone. What would you do?
Mm.
How would you adapt? What do you think would be necessary?
Mm.
Ken's got a good statement here, right? He says part of the issue is how we define freedom. Again, so for the context of just our conversation, just talking about the idea of, okay, let's try to figure out what it would look like for us to prepare to be an underground church. And again, it may seem like a ridiculous scenario, but the reality is that we know that at some point, according to Scripture, we're going to face some really significant hardship
Yeah.
in the Christian faith,
Yeah.
and so that could look like our faith becoming illegal. And so, what would need to adjust in our own faith practices in order to be able to be prepared for something like that?
I think it's an interesting point because a lot of times we consider we play around with the easier questions, not the harder ones, as far as this scenario goes, where it's like, well, what if my friends decided to not hang out with me anymore? And some people right there are like, nope, I'm not in for it. Like I'll change my beliefs based on that. And that's definitely not just a possibility, it's a plausibility, with coming to faith in Jesus. And now we have to go deeper than that in this scenario, though. And it's like, well, what happens if they say no more? You're not allowed. Now, obviously, okay, well, we still practice our faith, but how do we do it in a way that is A, glorifying to God and his bride? Because like you talked about, it's not just a doom and gloom and I told you so, but B, also in a way that is responsible to our families, to our loved ones, that we aren't going way weird, with it and way overboard with it or anything. I think you and I have had this conversation where, you and I, this is easy for you and I. It's we'd be in jail,
Yep.
for being the instigators.
Yeah.
We'd
It's
be
like,
the
see
people.
y'all.
Yeah. So this is more of a conversation for everybody else because you and I know where we're gonna be.
Here's an interesting one. So, Alex is saying that he believes that a new generation of believers are going to rise up. I think that's an interesting point, right?
Yeah.
People that will still be able to reach unbelievers.
Mhm.
Circumstances where maybe they will have lost their lives.
Well,
They're
and
gonna be
it's
much stronger.
it's
Yeah,
it's a lot like what God tells Elijah. Like there's always a remnant.
right.
He always will have a remnant, and so even if it's underground, God can still move. And I think China is a great example of that because, as you said, it's not an exaggeration to say millions of people are coming to the Lord in China
Yeah,
through a church that is outlawed.
yeah, which is interesting, right? So, I went online and I came across an article that suggested, three lessons that we
Mm.
could learn from the underground church. And I thought, you know what? Let's just take a look at them, see what we think, and just have a conversation together
Mhm.
about what things we could learn from the underground church. And there's probably a great deal more than just these three, but it's a good place to start. So,
Mm.
one of the lessons was that the underground church moves from house of worship to the home. It's interesting. There's a quote here from a guy by the last name is Comiskey. He says, all of this remarkable growth occurred in the underground churches that met in homes after Western missionaries were expelled from China.
Mm.
The idea here is that in 1982, like just imagine this. I don't. You were born, right?
Nope.
No, you weren't even. You
Nope.
weren't even born. Okay, this is awesome. Anyway, for those of us who were, 1982, I was in grade 2. There were about 1.3 million Christians. 18 years later, okay, so 18 years later, that number has risen to nearly 90 million.
Hmm.
So they went from 1.3 million in China in 1982, and then Western missionaries are out, no longer allowed to be there. 18 years later, 90 million. What must have happened? Like something significant took place there, right? And so one of the things they're saying is that it moved from the idea of the house of worship to worship being a general practice of the home, right? So the house of worship to the home. And I find it interesting, the idea of sort of that New Testament model of we're going to meet in the temple courts, right? But we're
Mm.
going to meet in the homes, and the most significant growth happened in the homes, right?
Yeah.
So I find that interesting. What do you think of that? The idea of moving from the house of worship to the homes.
I think it's conducive to growth when you have smaller groups of people gathering in that way, because their common their common tribulation, their common trial
Mhm.
of being persecuted brings them together in a more intimate way. But then
Okay.
also they're not able to, like, if you're going to someone's house, like a literal house church, you can't sit in the back.
No, there's no backseater.
And you can't be a person that's just ignoring, like, you don't want to be there, because we have plenty of people that go to church, but they don't, like, they do it out of habit, or out of, for younger kids, maybe their parents are bringing them, or maybe their spouse is bringing them, or whatever. But you don't go to a house church to ignore the sermon. Especially if getting found out means you could lose your life.
Right.
And so I think that environment means that there's a more serious faith happening, a more intimate relationship, not just between you and the people around you, but you and God as well.
Do you also think that people would have a greater sense of their need of each other?
Sure. Yeah.
Right? Like if it's illegal,
Hmm.
then it's unlikely that people will be very bold,
Yeah.
in terms of asserting things,
Yeah.
like asserting themselves, saying, "Hey, I'm a Christian. Are you?" Right? Like
Hmm.
it's more likely to be, for many, I would imagine anyway. Like if they're concerned about safety issues,
Yeah.
that setting, that environment of connecting with people, would have a greater value than maybe what we place on it now. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I know we love being together,
Hmm.
but that there is a greater value on those times together, I imagine.
Well, and I think that there's a greater care happening in those smaller groups. So when Frank doesn't show up to the meeting, it could be he's sick, or it could be he's dead. Like,
Sure.
it, and that creates more of a desire to actually see each other healthy
Yeah.
and thriving, and that kind of thing, on a more regular basis. Because it's not like, oh, where was he this week? I didn't see him in church. Oh, he must have been, camping.
Right.
It's like, oh, I didn't see him in church. Did they get him?
Is he
You know?
okay?
Yeah, exactly. And
Right.
so it becomes a very caring environment.
Here we got a statement here. If it's illegal, maybe I would just be more into my faith. Bad me. Just kidding. Yeah, you know what? That could be right. Like if it's illegal, it probably requires a bit of an evaluation
Mm-hmm.
for us, right? To evaluate where am I at in my faith, right? Like, and I'm just thinking, like, if my Bible is outlawed and I'm not allowed any apps or any of those kinds of things, like, how well do I know it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean,
I
those are
remember
sobering thoughts, right?
one of the stories that I tell our discipleship groups that we go through is one of the reasons why we memorize, and not one of the reasons, sorry. One of the stories I tell them about memorizing scripture is that there was a little girl back in the 50s who was 8 years old, and her church did a thing where if the kids in the church, they had this summer camp, and if the kids in the church were willing to memorize 300 verses, these 300 verses that the church had, then the church would pay for them to go to summer camp.
Hmm.
And at 8 years old, this girl did it. Spent the whole year, memorizing 300 verses. And she was the only one out of the 8 or 9 kids or whatever that signed up to try. She was the only one that did it. And the church paid for her to go to summer camp, whatever. But she talks about like 50 years later, she was going through crisis and she had kind of not really walked away from the faith, but just hadn't taken it very seriously, And she said she was going through a crisis in her life. And all of a sudden, these verses that she had memorized when she was 8 years old started popping up in her mind and encouraging her, God is with me and all these kinds of things. And it's interesting because memorization is something that a lot of us look at and it's like, why do I need to memorize it? I have apps. I've got 4 Bibles in every room in my house, like, why do I need to memorize it? And it's like, well, I think, again, there goes that, just the taking it for granted a little bit, like having it is great. And we should be very appreciative that we have it. But hiding it in our hearts is where we are prepared. That's where we prepare ourselves for the time when we don't have a physical copy.
So that's what brings me back to this whole idea of what does it mean for us to prepare ourselves as if we are those who may one day be living out of faith in an environment where it would be considered illegal? Here's a good question. Enrique, he asks, okay, so basically, yeah, how long do we think before YouTube will start blocking our online church stuff? I don't know. I think that if YouTube does decide to block church things, which hasn't really been a threat at this point that I'm aware of anyway, I don't know how to answer that. I'm just not sure how long it would, when that might take place. I think a good follow-up question to that would be, okay, then what?
Yep.
Right? Like, what do we then do if the message can't go out?
Yep.
Through digital media? Well, then we, as it talks about in the book of Acts there, right? It's like those who had been scattered preach the word wherever they went.
Yeah.
This is kind of what I want to get to. I would love in my own life and for the lives of the people that call Pathway home to be just charged up by the idea of like, the good news is such good news that everywhere I go, I want it to be known, even in times where we're being scattered, right? PJ's following up on what you were talking about. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Passages that he has memorized have been extremely helpful.
Yeah.
I can attest to that as well. I mean, the idea of just for some reason, it's like the Holy Spirit just draws up that passage at the right time when you need it. It's interesting. And I think that like Bible memorization is amazing. I think when we talk about the idea of what it means to be the church in a space where the church may not be encouraged, allowed, this idea of opening my home, like the believer's
Mm,
home, becomes the place of ministry.
yeah.
So here's the question. What would it take? What would it take for everybody here who's checking this thing out online right now, and even for you and me, Andrew? What would it take for our homes to become the new place of ministry?
Can I be snarky for a second?
Go ahead, be snarky, man.
I was just going to say restrictions to lift.
Yes. Right now, it's the air high fives.
Yeah, exactly. I do think that it's a question that's uncomfortable for me because personally, I'm not a how do I put this in public words? It's not the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about like how to minister to people is, oh, I'll invite them over to my house.
Hmm.
Uh, and so like for me, I think what it would take is not having the option of anything else.
Oh, okay. So if
Uh,
the large group option was taken away, that would be the impetus to start the small group option.
maybe not small group, but if we're talking church, because I think small groups are right now. I think I would do a small group every week. I do a small group every week with my discipleship group and stuff. So maybe not small group isn't the word I would use, but definitely like home church or house church or whatever you want to say, where it's like, okay, this is our weekly, this is what we get. Like, this is our feeding. Is to me, it would be like, okay, that's now the option that we have. I either do this or I don't get church fellowship, period.
Right. Here, I like this one. People need, people are going to have to use their talents and their gifts, right? Like, so imagine 1,000 people with one pastor and 10 people singing in front. We'll have 100 pastors and 900 people singing. Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah, because it's all about like you end up mobilizing more people. You
Mhm.
build into the priesthood of all believers, and people are being equipped, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, well,
yeah,
and like I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, where it's like you have that more intimate connection with that body of people in your house.
yeah,
There is that connection, and again, the reliance on each other, the trust that goes in there, the praying for one another. All of those things I think increases, not decreases.
sure.
Again, and so yeah, I do believe that it, necessity is the breeding ground for it.
Sure. Yeah. One of the things he says here, I'll just read the quote. The home has always been given to us as a template for grassroots ministry, right? So, for example, Acts 2:46. So, continuing daily with one accord in the temple, right? So that's
Mm,
big church, and breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity in their heart. So they got the large group, they had small group. Acts 5:42, and daily in the temple and in every house, they did not cease teaching and preaching Jesus as the Christ.
mm.
And I think that's like that's important, right?
What a word! What a word there.
What's that?
Daily. I can't get over the idea of daily.
Right?
Like, it was a daily, and not just a daily thing, but a long time every day. I mean, Paul was preaching so long that he had people falling asleep.
I think I could do that in shorter amount
Well,
of
yeah,
time.
I can do that in the half hour that I have. But it's wild to me. I heard a pastor that was talking about like how uh, we shouldn't be like that and we can't be like that and it's not realistic to think like that and all these things, and it's like, well, I mean, I do agree it's not really realistic for most people to give up their whole day to go spend in church every day. But what we don't understand back here is like early church people were selling themselves into slavery to pay off the debts of other church members. They were doing whatever it took to take care of the body of believers.
Yeah.
And we are not, again, we're not in that situation. And so necessity again is not there for us to do that.
Yeah. But even just this idea that they were committed to um, intentional
Mm,
discipling, intentional understanding of who Jesus was,
yeah.
um, both in the temple and in every home. I think we have a lost, I would say, the lost art of house ministry.
Mm, hmm.
The idea of believers. I like how Ken said it. Like Ken talks about it, certainly he's talking about it from the perspective of hospitality. But I think this also, could also apply to things like sharing our faith with others and being intentional with each other as we grow together, and hospitality being a part of that as we open our homes to each other.
Hmm.
But yeah, the idea that it's getting lost and we get further into that self-loving culture of North America. Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Right. Like our homes become safe havens from others instead of safe
Hmm.
havens for others.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, in the 50s and the 60s, houses were built big. The living room was the biggest part of the house so that you could have people over, so that you could have your parties and you could do your thing together as your neighborhood, whatever.
Yeah.
And now houses like the master bedroom is often the biggest, room and things like that where I think we retreat into our cave to stay protected from the outside world or whatever,
Yeah.
and not inviting people in to be refreshed by the word.
I think Kate asked a great question. Like how can you reach, a non-believing person if it's in a house in those days?
Mm,
And I think that brings us to like the second point that they make in this particular article. It says the underground church will love their neighbor and neighborhood.
mm-hmm,
The whole idea that okay, the Good Samaritan story is a fantastic story, right? And we know that story, and it did a lot of things for us in helping us understand that everyone is our neighbor,
mm-hmm.
right? Everyone is our neighbor.
Yeah. There's
Um,
a good book called The Art of Neighboring, and it's the idea of how do we love our neighbor as we love ourselves, because that's a command from Jesus, and it talks about like oftentimes we have defined our neighbor as the cause that we are paying $40 to every month, or whatever, when in reality, like how many people do you know that are your neighbor, by first name? Do you know their
sure.
birthdays? Do you know what they're going through in their life? Have you talked to them about Jesus? Do they know who you stand with? And I think that that's something that's huge is I think on a very basic level we should be practicing in preparation for this, what we're talking about here, of a restriction of faith or whatever. I think in preparation we need to be teaching ourselves again how to love our neighbors on a very base level. Like
Yeah.
I need to know their names, and I need to take genuine interest and care into their lives.
Jolene says, saying, it's so true.
Mhm.
Somewhere along the line, we decided that there was only certain things were only for formal church leaders, like communion, right? And she says we absolve ourselves of of ministry roles.
Mhm.
I think there's some truth to that. There's an interesting dynamic that takes place when you start dealing with some of the ways we've grown accustomed to doing church, right? So I remember I still to this day deal with a question like, um, is anyone allowed to baptize, or is it just pastors that are
Mhm.
allowed to baptize,
Yeah.
right? Like those kinds of questions, or who can serve communion?
Yeah. I literally just tonight had a person ask me who can do a funeral. Can only a pastor do a funeral? And
Nope.
and I know that there's certain laws in certain places that that's the case as far as government records and stuff, but It's like, well, why should a pastor be the only one that could administer communion? I've never understood that. Like, we do
The part
nothing.
that drives me insane too, right? Because we formalize something that it's not that it's informal, but that it's supposed to be relational,
Hmm.
right? Sheila, I like what you're saying here. The idea of we need to use our gifts better, and just figuring out like, okay, what is your gift and how are you to use it? But
Hmm.
going back to Kate's question about how do you reach people, I do think it goes back to this idea, exactly what you were talking about, Andrew, the art of neighboring. Do I know my neighbor? Like, do I actually know them? Am I a person they will call when they're in need?
Hmm. Yeah.
And that's a big one, right? Like, so if they're needing something, and I'm not just talking about cake and I borrow a cup of sugar, though, hey, it's great to have those kinds of neighbors too. I know I
Yeah.
have. Um, but if there's like a deep need in life, like, are we who they call?
We are to be the light in the world. Like, we are to be the hope of the world. I mean, not us personally, but we're to share that hope with them and share that light with them. And so it's a telling thing when non-believers come to, like, I mean, how encouraged are all of us when we hear of a story of like, oh, my non-believing friend came to me to ask me advice about God or advice about relationships, or we're all like, oh, that's great. You know why? Because they're coming to the right person. And so, like, we should hope that all of our neighbors, all of the people who are in direct contact with us, our coworkers, our neighbors, our friends, our family, that we're the people that they come to with anything, you know?
Yeah, and maybe we should. And this is a general, obviously blanket statement because this isn't true of every person. But maybe we need to think of our neighbors less as people that we need to hide from or only see during, the block parties,
Hmm.
but really actually ask the Lord to break our hearts for our neighborhood. You want to know how you reach people? Man, you first got to submit to the Lord. That's
Mm-hmm.
the starting place for all of it, right? We submit to the Lord and we ask for Him to break our hearts for our neighborhoods.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ken was saying here, uh, story of a retired teacher spent 30 years making cold calls from a payphone in her lobby every day until she had shared the gospel with at least 3
Mm.
people a day. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
absolutely amazing.
and that goes to, I've heard it asked where it's like, how many Christians have come up to you and on a plane, or, complete strangers, and they said, let me tell you about Jesus,
Yeah.
and it's like, I've only had it happen to me once in my entire life. And it's like, well, that's telling, where we're supposed to be the megaphone for Jesus. And so I'm not trying to be harsh on anybody here because I'm just as bad as at it as anybody. But it is that attitude of like, it should, I mean, especially in a town like this, like in Winkler, where we kind of assume a lot of people are saved. How many people are we assuming are saved that could really just not even, maybe they don't need the gospel, maybe they just need to see somebody who believes the gospel.
So maybe that takes us to like the third point that they have here, and that is the underground church will empower record numbers of laborers for the kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the dangers, and it was kind of alluded to earlier, that 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 we create these professional church workers who they're the only ones who can do the work of ministry. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just backwards, right? Like that's just not
Yeah.
how the scripture talks about it. We know specifically the role of pastor is to equip the saints for the work of the ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea that in that underground setting, like we would be doing more equipping,
Mm-hmm.
right? Probably more equipping than we do now. So all that time that we spend preparing sermons, we're teaching others how to handle the word,
Yeah.
right? Like that's a completely different scenario.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of empowering. So if we think about it, the way we manage an underground church scenario by learning from the underground church is that we make sure that our homes are places of ministry, that we seek the Lord's face and ask Him to break our hearts for our neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
so that we'll actually have a heart for the neighbor.
Yeah.
And we empower people for ministry.
Yeah.
That sounds like a pretty awesome thing. So here's a question. Why wouldn't we do some of that stuff now already?
Yeah. I think that that's the biggest question for us. Because if we're not doing it now, we won't do it later. Or we might do it later, but we'll be
That's what they
way
say,
less
right?
prepared. Yeah.
And I don't mean for that to be a negative thing, but I'm wondering, like, look, we have all of this quote unquote freedom to be equipped, freedom to open our homes, freedom to be able to love our neighbors, and freedom to express the gospel.
Mm.
Why wouldn't we use this freedom better?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Kate says here, I think we're all just afraid or too comfortable, so we don't do anything. You know, Kate, I think that there's some truth to that. But I will say, like, in a place where we love our freedoms so much, why not use our freedoms to advance the gospel?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why not allow that to be the thing, right? PJ says, lots of conviction here tonight. It's good. So much to chew on, so much to act on. I am convicted by these things a lot as well. Like, look, yeah, I'm a pastor. Does that mean that I got it all together? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, the reality is that as I search the word, I am convicted all the time. Not about not being good enough. That's not what the conviction is. The conviction is this thing that stirs my soul to say we need to be more active in our faith, more connected to the Lord, more connected to each other, so that we advance the gospel and seek his kingdom purposes. Like, that's just awesome. So here's the challenge for everyone. Are you ready? This is a simple one, I think, anyway. How about this? Make your home a place of ministry. Here's your challenge. Either start or host a small group when we are physically allowed to be in each other's homes. Either start or host a small group, or even that, like, contact Pastor Andrew and he'll help you figure out some ways forward here, so that we can follow, what we need to follow, but at the same time still be able to have these things happen. But why not have a conversation with whomever it is that you live with? And if you're living on your own and you just have your apartment, your house, whatever it is, how could your home be a place of ministry where you are loving your neighborhood, right? So you're connecting with the people around you, and you're getting empowered for ministry. When is the last time you did something to empower you for ministry? So why don't we try these things? Open your home, love your neighborhood, get empowered. If you want to know how to do any of those three things, you need to talk to Pastor Andrew. We've got discipleship groups that help all of us learn how to disciple people. We have small group ministries, and we have an intense desire to see every community in our region reached with the opportunity to hear about Jesus. Jackie says it well. I love it. Here we go. We have a huge ministry at home already with all these little girls.
It's my women's ministry.
Yeah, you got a young families ministry right there. The reality is, I'm not saying that I'm not saying that you can't have private time or any of these other things. But what is one more step towards Jesus looking like in your life? Looking like in my life?
Yeah.
How do we do this? And so that we don't get caught up in the things of the world. Look, we're in it, not of it. So that we can move towards those kingdom purposes and kingdom mentality, a biblical worldview. That's what I would love. Use our freedoms to advance the gospel. Using my home, using my words and my actions, and then going to my pastors to say, teach me how to do this, show me how to do this, how do I do this stronger, how do I learn this, how do I just come to us with the hows. And man, that would just be an amazing way to do church.
Yeah.
Gather and scatter.
Mm-hmm.
I love it.
Yep.
So we do have a couple of announcements for everybody as we close this evening off. We're just past an hour, and I apologize for that. I got a little preachy there, but too bad. Okay. This is actually our last broadcast at Pathway Late Night for now. The reason behind it is that now that we're back able to have in-person services, this thing is not needed in the same way anymore. We have chose this to be a space where we can connect with people, and this has been fun. We've certainly enjoyed connecting with people through it, but we're now able to connect in person at church, and so we're going to encourage you, if you're willing, sign up, register for church, and should this need arise again, we will definitely come back online so that we can connect with people again in this way. But for now, hey, this is the last one. Hope you enjoyed them. Other than that, Andrew, what am I missing for announcements?
I don't know. Come to church. Sign up.
Okay. Come to church. Love Jesus. Love others.
Do better.
Do better. No. But yeah, certainly hope that you guys have enjoyed our times together with this, and probably, maybe we'll come back depending on the need, and we'll kind of go from there. So share it with others if you think this was something that was convicting you. Maybe take your thoughts that you had and have a conversation with someone else and carry it forward. How can your home be a place of ministry? How can you love your neighborhood more? And how can you be equipped for more ministry? Such an awesome thing, and I think it's fun. Shane, thanks for the encouragement. Love you guys all out there, and yeah, we will see you at church. If you're wondering where to get more information about Pathways, pathwaycc.net. Feel free to go to the website. You've got all kinds of things you can find there. Download the Church Center app. It's got all kinds of things about groups, events, and all kinds of goodies in there, but especially how to sign up for church. So thank you guys so much. And if you're wondering what that passage was again, that was Acts chapter 8, verse 4. Those who have been scattered preached the word wherever they went. They didn't talk about or didn't stress the fact that they were scattered. They preached the word wherever they went. Let's be a people that preach the word wherever we go. Thanks, guys, and we'll see you at church. Bye-bye for now.